Then leave if you don't like living with us, shouted Nina, her arms folded like she owned the place. She stood in Grace Morgan's kitchen, her voice slicing through the quiet morning. 10 minutes later, Nina was the one screaming into her phone, calling the police and claiming Grace had lost her mind. But what Nina didn't know was that Grace had been recording their entire conversation. That's how it all started. The day Grace found herself packing her daughter-in-law's belongings while the woman called 911 on her. Grace was 67, a retired teacher, and until that day, she'd thought kindness still meant something. 8 months earlier, Grace's son Ethan had lost his job at the accounting firm. "Just for a while, Mom," he had said, showing up at her doorstep with Nina and 2 suitcases. "Until I get back on my feet." Grace believed him. Her husband, Peter, had passed away 2 years before, leaving her a beautiful 4-bedroom house in the quiet neighborhood of Maple Grove and a comfortable pension from 40 years of teaching high school English. She'd welcomed them in with open arms, unaware she was also opening her door to trouble. It began small, a few unpaid grocery bills, long showers that doubled the water bill, and the constant hum of the TV that ran day and night. "Mom, you're overreacting," Ethan had said one Tuesday morning when she gently suggested that 8 months was a long time for a temporary stay. Nina chimed in without looking up from her phone. "We contribute," she said, scrolling through photos of a Cancun vacation they'd taken using Grace's credit card. Grace's jaw tightened. "You mean you spend," she replied. Even she could hear the bite in her voice. Nina finally looked up, her eyes cool and sharp. "Grace, if you don't like living with us, you're free to leave." Grace froze. Leave? From her own home? She stared at the woman standing beside her refrigerator, the one she had bought, filled, and paid for with her pension. Ethan shifted awkwardly, eyes darting between his wife and his mother, but said nothing. That silence burned more than Nina's insult ever could. For a moment, Grace wondered how her sweet, respectful son had become a man who let his wife speak to his mother that way. Something inside her snapped. The old Grace would have apologized just to keep the peace, maybe even offered to pack her own bags. But this version of Grace had been quiet too long. "You're right, Nina," she said softly. "I'll start packing." She walked upstairs calmly, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Nina followed, heels clicking against the wooden steps. She probably thought Grace was going to leave. Instead, Grace pulled a large suitcase from the closet, the one Nina had brought, and began tossing Nina's clothes inside. "What are you doing?" Nina shrieked. "Packing," Grace said calmly, adding Ethan's video game console on top of Nina's designer handbags. "Our stuff." "Exactly. You said if I didn't like living with you, I could leave." "Well, this is my house, dear. My name's on the deed. So, technically, you're the ones who need to go." Nina's face turned a furious shade of red. She snatched her phone and started dialing frantically. "Yes, I need the police and an ambulance," she said, voice trembling on cue. "My mother-in-law is having some kind of breakdown. She's throwing things and threatening us. Please hurry." Grace stared in disbelief as Nina performed her little act. "Mother-in-law," she muttered. "Since when am I family?" Within minutes, police lights flashed through the window. 2 officers and a young paramedic stood at the door. Behind them was a black sedan Grace didn't recognize. "Mrs. Morgan," the older officer said politely. "We received a call about a disturbance." "Come in," Grace said evenly. "Though I'm not sure what disturbance you're referring to." Nina appeared at the top of the stairs, tear-streaked, voice quivering. "Thank God you're here, officers." She just started screaming and throwing our things. Grace folded her arms as the officers looked from her to Nina. "Ma'am," the younger one asked, "is this your residence?" "Yes. I've lived here for 32 years. Nina jumped in quickly. "We've been staying here to take care of her since her husband died." "Take care of me?" Grace nearly laughed. The woman couldn't even flush the toilet, let alone care for someone. The older officer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morgan, your daughter-in-law says you were packing their belongings and demanding they leave. Is that true?" "Absolutely. She told me if I didn't like living with them, I could leave. So I decided to help them pack instead." The young paramedic stepped forward gently. Mrs. Morgan, I'm just going to ask a few quick questions to make sure you're okay. Can you tell me what day it is? Grace smiled patiently. Tuesday, October 15th, 2:30 in the afternoon. Do you know who the president is? She rattled off not just the president's name, but her address, social security number, and even quoted Shakespeare for good measure. The paramedic blinked. She seems completely fine. That's when the man from the black sedan walked in, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit. Officers, I'm Dr. Howard Bennett, he announced. Mrs. Morgan is one of my patients. Grace frowned. I've never seen you before in my life. Grace, Dr. Bennett said, his tone dripping with professional sympathy, you came to see me last month about your memory issues and paranoid thoughts about your family. Grace blinked slowly. That's impossible. I've never needed a psychiatrist, and I certainly don't have paranoid thoughts. Nina descended the stairs, fake tears streaming down her cheeks. Mom, you don't remember? You've been so confused lately. Last week, you accused us of stealing your credit cards. That's because you did steal my credit cards. Grace snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. The officers exchanged wary glances. Dr. Bennett sighed softly. This kind of angry denial is common with dementia patients. They often accuse loved ones of theft. I do not have dementia. Grace shouted. The older officer stepped forward carefully. Mrs. Morgan, would you mind if we took a look around, just to make sure everything's all right? Be my guest, Grace replied, standing tall. They moved through her house, her spotless living room, her kitchen, her tidy office. Grace watched silently as they took in every detail. In the guest room, clothes were scattered across the floor where she'd been packing. To someone who didn't know better, it might look like chaos. Dr. Bennett observed the mess, pretending to look concerned. Grace, can you tell us why you were packing these things? Because Nina told me if I didn't like living with them, I could leave. So, I decided to help them leave. But these aren't your belongings to pack, he said gently. They're in my house, and I've been feeding and housing these two for 8 months, without a cent in return. Nina gasped dramatically. She's been obsessed with money lately. Yesterday, she accused us of being freeloaders. Grace clenched her fists, realizing anything she said would be twisted. This wasn't an argument anymore. It was a setup. Mrs. Morgan, Dr. Bennett said softly, I think it would be best if you came with us to the hospital. Just for observation. And if I refuse? Well, the older officer replied awkwardly, we can't force you, but Dr. Bennett here has concerns about your mental health. Grace's eyes moved around the room. Nina dabbing fake tears, Ethan looking helpless, 2 officers who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, and a stranger pretending to be her doctor. She felt oddly calm. I'll go, she said finally, but I'm calling my attorney first. Grace, Nina said quickly. You don't need an attorney. We're family. Grace gave a small, cold smile. Exactly why I need one. She pulled out her phone and dialed her lawyer, Laura Chin, who had handled her husband's estate. Laura, it's Grace Morgan. Meet me at Maple Grove Hospital. Apparently, I'm having a mental breakdown.
What?
Grace, what's going on? I'll explain when you get there, Grace said, and hung up. Dr. Bennett frowned. Mrs. Morgan, involving lawyers right now might complicate things. Grace tilted her head. Doctor, since I've never met you before, I think having legal representation is perfectly reasonable. The younger cop looked puzzled. Wait, you've never met him? How are you as doctor? Dr. Bennett's practiced smile faltered. Mrs. Morgan is confused about our previous sessions. When did these sessions happen? Grace asked sweetly. I can't disclose that, he said stiffly. Oh, so you can discuss my supposed memory issues in front of the police, but not when I supposedly visited your office? Nina jumped in quickly. Mom, you don't remember because of your confusion. Grace laughed bitterly. Nina, I've balanced household budgets, graded thousands of essays, and remembered every birthday in this family. But since you moved in, I've suddenly developed dementia? How convenient. The older officer was starting to frown. Dr. Bennett, do you have any proof you've treated Mrs. Morgan before? My records are at the office, he muttered. Which office? Grace asked. What's it called? Where is it? That's irrelevant to the situation, he said sharply. This interrogation isn't good for her condition. Interrogation? Grace barked out a laugh. I'm asking a man who claims to be my doctor where his office is located. If that's hostile, then maybe I am losing my mind. Nina's eyes darted nervously between the officers. Can we just take her to the hospital? Please, she needs help. That's when Laura Chin arrived, tall, composed, and furious. She strode into the room like a storm in a navy suit, briefcase swinging. Which one of you is Dr. Bennett? She demanded. I am, he said, straightening. Good, Laura replied coolly. Because I just called the state medical board. Dr. Howard Bennett's license was suspended 6 months ago for participating in fraudulent psychiatric holds. The room fell silent. That's impossible, Nina whispered. Oh, it's very possible, Laura said, eyes like steel. You've been working with a con artist who makes a living helping greedy relatives commit elderly people against their will for a hefty fee. Dr. Bennett's face went pale. This is a misunderstanding, he stammered, edging toward the door. The only misunderstanding, Laura said, stepping closer, was thinking you could pull that stunt in my client's house. The fake doctor bolted. The officers immediately turned to Nina, their questions coming fast. Grace stood silently, her heart racing, not from fear, but from the realization that she'd just taken her first step toward justice. The next morning, Grace sat in Laura's office, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup while legal documents covered the mahogany desk. After the police had taken statements and Dr. Bennett had disappeared into the night, Nina and Ethan had retreated to the guest room, whispering furiously. How long has this been brewing? Laura asked, adjusting her glasses. 8 months officially, Grace replied. But I think Nina had her eyes on my house since the day she met Ethan. Laura nodded slowly. The fake psychiatric hold is part of a larger scam. Dr. Bennett's real name is Brian Kellerman. He's been running this operation across several states. Grace leaned forward. How does it work? A relative calls 911 claiming their elderly parent is unstable. Kellerman shows up pretending to be a doctor, convinces police the person needs psychiatric evaluation, and once the victim's hospitalized, the family files for guardianship. Grace's breath caught. So, they were trying to have me declared incompetent. Exactly. Your daughter-in-law would have gained legal control over your home, accounts, and medical decisions. Grace thought of Nina's fake tears, her trembling voice. It had all been rehearsed. Laura pulled out another file. I did some digging. Before she married your son, Nina was Nina Price, then Nina Torres, then Nina Duncan. 3 marriages, 3 older husbands. Each one died under suspicious circumstances. Grace's hands trembled. You're telling me? The first left her a condo in Florida. The second, an investment portfolio. The third, his bank accounts. And now she's married to your 42-year-old son, whose mother happens to have a paid-off house and healthy pension. Grace whispered, she's a predator. Laura nodded grimly. And she almost succeeded. Grace stood by the window, looking down at the bustling street. Normal people with normal lives, while she'd been living with a vulture under her roof. What do we do now? She asked quietly. First, Laura said, you install security cameras. Record every interaction. Second, we contact law enforcement in the other states where Nina operated. Build a pattern. And third, a slow, fierce smile crossed Laura's face. We make sure Nina gets exactly what she deserves. That afternoon, Grace returned home to find Nina in her kitchen, pretending to make a sandwich as if nothing had happened. How are you feeling today, Mom? Nina asked sweetly. Better, Grace replied. Though I'm curious about something. Oh, your previous husbands. Nina froze, knife hovering over the mayonnaise jar. My what? Grace leaned against the counter, her eyes never leaving Nina's face. I met the most interesting detective today, she said casually. He told me some fascinating stories about a certain Nina Price, or was it Torres? Or Duncan? The color drained from Nina's face. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. Grace reached into her purse and pulled out the small recorder Laura had given her. Just like you didn't know that Dr. Bennett's real name is Brian Kellerman, a convicted fraud. Nina's composure cracked. You can't record me without my permission. Actually, Grace said, smiling faintly, in this state, I can record any conversation I'm part of, especially in my own house. Nina's expression hardened, and she started backing toward the door. Just then, Ethan walked in from the living room, remote in hand. What's going on? Your mother's recording us, Nina snapped. She's paranoid. Grace stared at Agent Mitchell in disbelief. You want me to act as bait? Exactly, Sarah replied. We'll leak that you've recovered your stolen funds and are looking for safe investments. Someone in the network will approach you. They always do. Ethan looked horrified. Mom, that's dangerous. Grace gave a tired smile. Sweetheart, I've already been drugged, robbed, and nearly declared insane. I think I can handle a conversation. Sarah chuckled softly. Don't worry. You'll be protected. We'll have eyes and ears on you the entire time. The plan was simple. They'd let word spread that Grace Morgan was wealthy, vulnerable, and cautious, but willing to trust again. Somewhere out there, one of the predators would take the bait. Grace spent the next few days going about her routine, shopping, gardening, pretending life was normal, while the FBI monitored her calls. It took less than a week for the trap to spring. It happened on a Thursday morning. Grace was in the cereal aisle at the grocery store when a well-dressed woman approached her with a friendly smile. Excuse me, she said warmly. Aren't you Grace Morgan? I think our daughters went to the same school years ago. Grace didn't recognize her. I'm sorry, I don't think we've met. Oh, I'm Helen Curtis, the woman said, adjusting her pearl necklace. I overheard you talking to the pharmacist about managing your retirement funds. I went through the same thing after my husband died. Grace blinked. She hadn't spoken to the pharmacist at all, but she played along. That must have been difficult. Helen nodded sympathetically. It was, but I found an amazing financial advisor. He helps widows like us protect our assets from greedy relatives. You should call him Robert Davidson. She handed Grace a crisp business card, smiled sweetly, and walked away. As soon as Helen disappeared, Grace texted Sarah the details. Within minutes, the agent replied, Perfect. We know him. He's been under surveillance for months. 2 days later, Grace's phone rang. Mrs. Morgan, said a smooth, confident voice, This is Robert Davidson. Helen Curtis gave me your number. She mentioned you might be interested in some safe investment strategies. Grace sat at her kitchen table, glancing at the unmarked van across the street where Sarah's team listened in. Perhaps, she said lightly. I've had a few bad experiences lately. Robert's tone was calm, reassuring. I understand completely. Elder financial abuse is everywhere these days. It's important to protect yourself, even from family. He was good, Grace thought. Polished. Professional. Manipulative in the most charming way. I'd love to meet you for coffee, he said. I have an office downtown. Very private, very secure. They arranged to meet the following Tuesday. When Grace arrived, she almost doubted he was a criminal. Robert Davidson looked the part of a respectable advisor. Silver hair, glasses, a warm handshake, and a desk covered in framed family photos. Mrs. Morgan, he said, gesturing to the leather chair. I'm so glad you came. Helen speaks very highly of you. Grace smiled politely. She's very kind. She's one of my success stories, he said, lowering his voice. Her stepchildren tried to have her declared incompetent, but I helped protect her estate. Grace feigned curiosity. How? There are legal strategies most people don't know, he said smoothly. We transfer your assets temporarily into a protected account while we create what's called a senior asset shield. It keeps your funds safe from manipulation. Temporarily transfer? Grace asked. Just while we process the paperwork, he said confidently. Usually 2 weeks. Robert continued, his voice soothing. During that time, your money is completely safe. If anything happens, medical issues, family interference, the funds stay protected until you're ready to resume control. Grace nodded thoughtfully, pretending to consider it. It sounds complicated. Not at all. You just signed temporary power of attorney so I can move the funds. Everything else I handle. Grace tilted her head. And where exactly are my assets held in the meantime? In a secure account managed by my firm, fully insured, Robert said with a reassuring smile. Grace forced a small laugh. You make it sound so easy. It is easy, once you trust the right people, he replied. Time, however, is critical. If your family has already tried to question your competency, waiting even a few days could expose you legally. The perfect manipulation, urgency dressed as concern. Grace left the meeting feeling sick, but determined. Back home, Sarah listened to the recording, her expression grave. He's good. Too good. He's done this before. Grace poured coffee for the agents gathered in her kitchen. How many victims? At least 20, Sarah said. He gets them to sign over temporary authority, then arranges fake emergencies. They're declared unfit, placed in facilities, and their money disappears. Grace's stomach twisted. And no one stops him? Until now, Sarah said. We'll have you agree to his plan tomorrow. Once he has you sign those papers, we'll have everything we need. Grace looked at her hands, steady but cold. What happens to the victims already in those homes? Sarah's voice softened. Once we have proof, we'll get them out. But it may take time. That night, Grace lay awake replaying Robert's words in her head. He was charming, too polished, too perfect. The kind of man predators trusted because victims always wanted to believe in kindness. The next morning, Grace called Robert. I've decided to move forward, she said evenly. Excellent, he replied. Can you come in this afternoon? Actually, Grace said sweetly, I'd be more comfortable reviewing the papers at home. My house feels safer. There was a pause on the other end. At your home? Yes, she said. Fewer distractions. Another pause. Then, of course. I'll bring the documents at 3. As soon as she hung up, Grace called Sarah. He's coming here. Perfect, Sarah said. We'll wire the house for sound and video. Don't worry, you won't be alone. By 2:30, agents were in position. Grace stood in her living room, her heart pounding but her face calm. The trap was finally closing. At exactly 3 o'clock, Robert Davidson's black sedan pulled into the driveway. He stepped out, carrying a leather briefcase and that same warm smile. Mrs. Morgan, he said, thank you for trusting me. Grace opened the door graciously. Of course. Please come in. Inside, Robert laid out his documents across the coffee table, power of attorney forms, transfer authorizations, medical directives, everything needed to strip a person of control. Now, I just want to explain everything clearly, he said. This first document gives me temporary authority to move your assets into the protective account. Grace nodded, pretending to read. It says you'll have full authority over my financial and medical decisions. Only temporarily, he said smoothly. Once the process is complete, control returns to you. And who decides when it's complete? Well, he said hesitantly, I do. Based on my professional judgment. Grace set the paper down slowly. So, you decide when I get my money back? Robert smiled, but a flicker of irritation crossed his face. You have to trust the process, Mrs. Morgan. This is exactly how I helped Helen Curtis. I'd love to speak with Helen, Grace said. Could you give me her number? I'm afraid I can't disclose client details. That's odd, Grace replied. She gave you my number. Robert stiffened slightly. Perhaps I can arrange for her to call you after we finish. Why not before? He hesitated, clearly sensing danger. Margaret, I sense hesitation. Is something bothering you? Yes, Grace said quietly. Just one thing. How did Helen know I was talking to the pharmacist about my finances when I never had that conversation? The mask slipped. Perhaps you forgot. Grace leaned forward, eyes hard. I'm 67, not senile. Try again. Robert's smile faltered. Mrs. Morgan, I think you're overanalyzing. Oh, I'm not analyzing, Grace interrupted softly. I'm observing. You said you've been in business over 10 years. But your license was only filed 3 years ago. You also claim to help seniors across multiple states, yet your company has no physical branches. Robert began shuffling the papers nervously. Perhaps this isn't the best time to make financial decisions. You seem a bit agitated. Grace rose from her chair, calm but firm. Actually, I think this is the perfect time. She walked to the window and pointed. Do you see that van parked across the street? Robert turned and froze. That's Agent Sarah Mitchell with the FBI, Grace said evenly. She's been listening to everything you just said. Robert's face drained of color. He shoved the papers into his briefcase and stood abruptly. This is entrapment. No, Grace replied. This is justice. The front door swung open. Agent Mitchell and two other officers stepped inside, badges raised. Robert Davidson, Sarah said, her voice steady. You're under arrest for elder fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Robert's mouth tightened. You have no idea what you're dealing with, he growled as they cuffed him. This goes higher than you think. Grace folded her arms. Then I hope they're ready when we get there. The agents led him out, reading his rights as flashbulbs from waiting reporters flickered through the window. Grace stood motionless, her pulse racing. She'd faced down a con man who preyed on people like her, and she'd won. Sarah turned back to her, smiling. Mrs. Morgan, we couldn't have done this without you. Grace exhaled slowly. What happens now? Now, Sarah said, we follow the money trail and see just how deep this operation runs. 2 hours later, Sarah called Grace with news that made her grip the phone tighter. We've gone through Davidson's files, she said. This isn't just a local scam. It's a national network. And we finally know who's at the top. Grace sank into her kitchen chair. Who is it? Sarah hesitated. A woman named Dr. Patricia Kellerman. Grace frowned. Kellerman? Like Brian Kellerman, the fake psychiatrist? His sister, Sarah confirmed. Only Patricia's a real doctor, a licensed geriatric specialist in Chicago. She's been running this entire operation from her clinic, using her medical connections to identify victims. Grace stared at the wall in disbelief. So, all this started with her? Exactly. She recruits fake doctors, corrupt lawyers, and financial agents like Davidson. Together, they've stolen over $50 million from elderly people across 15 states. Sarah arrived the next morning, carrying a thick folder. You should see this, she said, laying it on Grace's table. Inside were medical records, financial documents, and photographs of Grace's house. Grace's stomach twisted. How did they get all this? Someone in your medical provider's office leaked it. You were targeted 18 months ago, long before Nina met your son. Grace's eyes widened. You mean, Jennifer didn't find Ethan by accident? No, Sarah said quietly. She was directed to him. Patricia Kellerman's research flagged you as the perfect target. Widowed, comfortable income, adult son nearby, no immediate family support. Grace felt her breath catch. So, she used Ethan to get to me. Yes. It was all planned, the romance, the marriage moving in, the fake breakdown. Every piece of it was designed to take your life away. Grace stood by the window, her hands trembling. They would have put me in a facility, wouldn't they? Sarah nodded solemnly. Yes. We found your name in their files. You were scheduled to be transferred to a secured home in Florida, sedated and kept isolated while they drained your accounts. Grace's voice broke. For how long? Until you died, Sarah said softly. Or until the money ran out. Grace closed her eyes, swallowing back tears. The thought of being locked away, drugged, forgotten, it was almost too much to bear. And Ethan, she whispered. They would have told him you were getting specialized care for dementia. That visits made you agitated. He would have believed them. Grace's shoulders shook. I can't believe how close they came. Sarah placed a reassuring hand on hers. You didn't just save yourself. You saved hundreds of others. Over the next few weeks, the FBI dismantled Kellerman's empire piece by piece. There were arrests across the country, fake doctors, corrupt attorneys, forged nursing home administrators. By the end of the month, 187 victims had been rescued. When Sarah called again, her voice carried relief. We recovered all your funds, Mrs. Morgan, every penny with interest. And we're working to reunite the other victims with their families. Grace sat in silence for a long moment, then smiled faintly. That's the real victory, she said. That afternoon, she made tea and sat in her garden, surrounded by the rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of neighborhood children. 6 months ago, she'd been a grieving widow, afraid of being alone. Now she was something else entirely, strong, clear-headed, and unafraid. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a survivor who had exposed a criminal network and brought justice to people who couldn't fight for themselves. That evening, her phone rang. It was Ethan. "Mom, I just saw the news," he said, voice trembling. "They're saying you helped the FBI take down the Kellerman network." "I did what I had to do," Grace said softly. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered. "And I'm so sorry for everything Nina did, for everything I let her do." Grace's voice gentled. "Ethan, she manipulated you just like she tried to manipulate me. But you opened your eyes. That's what matters." There was silence on the line for a moment. "Mom," he said quietly, "can I come by tomorrow?" Grace smiled, tears stinging her eyes. "Of course, honey. Come home." Outside, the wind stirred the chimes on her porch. For the first time in months, the sound didn't make her anxious. It made her feel at peace. 6 months later, Grace received a formal letter from the Department of Justice thanking her for her cooperation. The operation had recovered $42 million and freed nearly 200 elderly victims from wrongful confinement. But the most meaningful moment came 3 weeks later when a woman named Dorothy Miller called her. "Mrs. Morgan," Dorothy said, her voice trembling with gratitude, "because of what you did, I'm back in my home with my family. You saved my life." Grace sat in silence, tears falling freely. "I'm so glad you're safe," she whispered. After the call, she looked around her quiet house, the same one where she'd once been accused of madness, and felt a deep, unshakable peace. She had fought back against something monstrous and won. For the first time in years, she knew exactly who she was. Grace Morgan, 67 years old, widow, retired teacher, survivor. No longer the polite woman who let others walk over her. No longer the grieving widow too afraid to stand up for herself. She was strong, capable, and unbreakable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she whispered to herself, "Never again." Her phone buzzed, a message from Agent Mitchell. "We got them all." Grace smiled, looking out at her garden where the flowers had begun to bloom again. "Good," she murmured. "Let them all rot where they belong." She took a slow sip of her tea and leaned back in her chair. The world was quiet, peaceful, and safe again. For the first time in a long while, Grace Morgan allowed herself to rest, not as a victim, but as the woman who refused to be one. Please like, comment, and subscribe.